Alright, get ready for this because we're about to dive deep into something mind-blowing that could completely change the way you see the story of Adam and Eve. We're not starting in the Bible. Nope. We're going even further back, thousands of years before the Bible was even written, back to ancient Sumer, one of the oldest known civilizations in human history. Picture this, it's 4000 BCE. We're in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where the Sumerians are building the first cities, creating the first written language, and here's where things get really interesting, writing down the stories of their gods. Among these gods were Enki and Ninhursag, and in their mythology, they created a paradise called Dilmun. This was a place without sickness, without aging, pure perfection. Sound familiar? It should, because it's eerily similar to the Garden of Eden. Now, here's where things take a wild turn. In the Sumerian myth, the gods aren't just hanging out in Dilmun. They're creating humans. Not just any humans, though humans designed to serve them. Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and creation, teams up with Ninhursag, the mother goddess, to craft humanity. The ingredients? Clay and divine breath. This concept of humans being made from the earth pops up again later in the Bible, where Adam is formed from dust. Coincidence? Maybe. But historians think these stories are way more connected than we've ever realized. In fact, many scholars believe the biblical story of Adam and Eve could be a reworking of these much older Sumerian myths. Back then, cultural stories traveled with people, and when the Hebrews found themselves in Mesopotamia during the Babylonian exile, they would have been exposed to these ancient tales. Over time, these Sumerian legends may have blended into what eventually became the Book of Genesis. And here's where it gets even crazier. The Sumerian paradise, Dilmun, wasn't just a place where humans lived in harmony with nature. According to the texts, there was a serpent, too. But in Sumerian mythology, the serpent wasn't some evil, scheming villain trying to trick humans. In some versions, it even helps Enki after he gets cursed by Ninhursag. In other words, the role of the serpent was totally different from the one we see in the Bible. Could the serpent in Eden have originally been a symbol of wisdom and healing? It's possible. But let's zoom in a little more on this character of Enki, because he's absolutely key to understanding the deeper layers of the Adam and Eve story. Enki wasn't just a creator, he was also a trickster god. He was known for bending the rules, for pushing boundaries, and for doing things that sometimes got him into trouble with other gods. So, when we look at the biblical God telling Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of knowledge, and then a serpent comes along and convinces them to break that rule, doesn't that feel like the sort of thing Enki, the ancient trickster, would have been involved in? What if Adam and Eve weren't the only ones who fell? What if the original Sumerian story is about how humans and gods were tangled up in this cosmic drama, where breaking rules was part of their nature? It turns the whole concept of original sin on its head. Instead of a straightforward tale about humanity's disobedience, this ancient version suggests that breaking the rules was baked into creation itself from the very beginning. So, when you think of Adam and Eve standing in their garden, staring at the forbidden fruit, maybe it wasn't just about a moment of weakness. Maybe it was about something much bigger, a story that's been retold over millennia, across different cultures, with layers of meaning lost and added along the way. What's absolutely fascinating is that these connections between Sumerian mythology and the biblical creation story weren't even recognized until relatively recently. As archaeologists began uncovering ancient Sumerian tablets in the 19th century, they realized that many of these stories predate the Bible by centuries, if not millennia. The pieces of the puzzle started to come together. Adam, Eve, the serpent, and the Garden of Eden might all be reimaginings of even older myths about creation, knowledge, and divine rebellion. Now we're stepping into a realm that a lot of people don't even know exists. We're talking about ancient, hidden texts that were considered too dangerous or controversial to include in the Bible. These aren't just random stories. These are sacred writings that were banned, left out, or even destroyed because they didn't fit the official narrative. And trust me, the story of Adam and Eve gets a whole lot wilder once you dig into these forbidden books. Let's start with one of the most interesting, the Book of Jubilees. This text was popular in ancient Jewish communities, but didn't make the cut when the Bible was compiled. And why? Well, it gives a very different spin on the Adam and Eve story. For one, it expands on the whole event of their banishment from Eden. According to the Book of Jubilees, Adam and Eve didn't just wander out of the garden after their disobedience, they had to face a whole series of struggles that the Bible never mentions. We're talking about real, human challenges, raising children, building a life in a harsh world, and even facing the cosmic consequences of their choices. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. The Book of Jubilees introduces a cast of characters that the Bible doesn't focus on. One of these is Mastema, a figure who can only be described as a type of devil or adversary, similar to Satan but way more complex. In this story, Mastema is actively working to lead humanity astray from the very beginning, manipulating events to push Adam and Eve into disobedience. It's almost like there's a hidden villain pulling the strings behind the scenes, something we never hear about in the traditional biblical narrative. It makes you wonder, were Adam and Eve victims of a larger cosmic plot? And then there's the Book of Enoch, another banned text that completely shifts the way we think about these early biblical events. This book is even crazier. In it, Adam and Eve are not just simple farmers kicked out of Eden. They're living in a world filled with angels, demons, and these mysterious beings called the Nephilim, the offspring of angels who descended to earth to mate with human women. Yeah, you heard that right. The Nephilim are described as giants, demigods, beings of incredible strength and knowledge, and their existence caused so much chaos that God decided to hit the reset button with a flood. What's really wild is that the Book of Enoch claims that these fallen angels, who were supposed to watch over humanity, were the ones who taught humans forbidden knowledge. Things like how to use metal to make weapons, how to practice magic, and even how to use makeup. So, while the Bible paints the story of humanity's fall as a direct result of Adam and Eve's disobedience, these banned books suggest that it wasn't just about eating a piece of fruit. Humanity was being influenced by these powerful celestial beings, and the whole fall of man was part of a much bigger, cosmic war. Now, why were these books banned? It's pretty clear that the early religious leaders wanted a streamlined story, one where humanity falls from grace because of a simple act of disobedience, and where the battle between good and evil is straightforward. But the banned texts offer something far more complex, almost like an ancient version of a political thriller. The story of Adam and Eve becomes part of a larger battle between divine forces, and it's not so clear-cut who's to blame for humanity's suffering. But let's get even deeper. There are other ancient texts, like the Apocalypse of Adam, a Gnostic work that flips everything upside down. In this version, Adam isn't some clueless guy who got tricked by a snake. Instead, he's portrayed as a kind of spiritual hero, someone who possesses secret knowledge about the true nature of the universe. The God who kicked Adam and Eve out of Eden? He's not even the supreme creator but a lower, flawed deity who was trying to keep humanity in ignorance. According to this story, eating the fruit wasn't the fall, it was the moment humanity began to wake up and understand the deeper truths of existence. Crazy, right? These hidden stories turn the simple tale we've all heard into a complex narrative about divine rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and the struggle for freedom. They paint Adam and Eve as players in a much larger cosmic game, where angels, gods, and even dark forces all had their hands in shaping humanity's destiny. What's fascinating is that for centuries, these banned books were nearly forgotten, buried by history. It wasn't until ancient manuscripts were rediscovered in places like Egypt and the Dead Sea that we started piecing together these alternate versions of the story. And when you read them, it's like unlocking a whole new layer of history, one that's been hidden away, kept out of sight because of how radically it reshapes our understanding of one of the most famous stories in the world. We've all heard about the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? It's this sneaky villain that convinces Eve to take a bite of that forbidden fruit, and boom, paradise lost. But what if I told you that, in many ancient traditions, the snake wasn't the villain at all. In fact, in some stories, the serpent is the hero. Yeah, you heard that right. In ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and even Gnostic texts, the serpent is actually seen as a symbol of wisdom, knowledge, and even rebirth. This is a far cry from the deceiver we've all grown up hearing about in the Bible. Let's rewind for a second to one of the oldest known mythologies, the Sumerians. In their myths, there's this god named Ninjishida. Guess what? He's depicted as a serpent. But Ninjishida isn't some evil trickster. No, he's the god of the underworld, healing, and transformation, connected to life, death, and rebirth. In ancient Mesopotamian beliefs, snakes were often seen as creatures of wisdom, creatures that could move between worlds, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. After all, snakes shed their skin and seem to be reborn, making them the perfect symbol of transformation. So, when the Hebrews were in Babylon during the exile and heard about these serpent deities, it's not hard to imagine that some of these older symbols snuck their way into the biblical story of Adam and Eve. But here's where things get really interesting. The serpent in the Garden of Eden doesn't just represent temptation, it represents knowledge. Specifically, the knowledge of good and evil. Now, hold up, does that sound all bad? Think about it, Adam and Eve didn't even know what good and evil were before they took that bite. They were just living in this state of ignorance, unaware of the larger complexities of life. And who comes along to show them the truth? The serpent. In Gnostic texts, especially the ones that were discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, the serpent takes on a totally different role. In these stories, the serpent isn't working against humanity, but for it. In some versions, the serpent is almost a savior figure, trying to free Adam and Eve from the control of a jealous, lower god. This god, sometimes called Yaldabaoth or the Demiurge, is the one who created the material world and wanted to keep humans ignorant, trapped in a kind of spiritual prison. So, when the serpent offers the fruit to Eve, it's not to cause her downfall, it's to awaken her, to give her and Adam the knowledge that the Demiurge was trying to hide. Yeah, that's right. The forbidden fruit wasn't just a test of obedience, it was an invitation to wake up to the bigger picture, to understand the true nature of reality. The serpent wasn't trying to ruin humanity's chances at paradise. It was trying to liberate them from being pawns in someone else's game. Now, let's zoom out for a second. This idea of the snake as a symbol of wisdom wasn't unique to the Gnostics or the Sumerians. It pops up in all sorts of ancient cultures. In ancient Egypt, the serpent god Wadjet was a protector, a symbol of royalty and sovereignty. The Greeks had their own serpent-related god, Asclepius, who was associated with healing and medicine, you know, the whole snake wrapped around the staff thing you still see on medical logos today. And even in the Bible, the serpent isn't always a bad guy. Fast forward to the story of Moses, and you've got the bronze serpent, the literal snake on a pole that healed the Israelites when they were bitten by venomous snakes. It's the same image that doctors use today. So, clearly, the idea of the snake being purely evil doesn't totally add up. Here's where it gets even more fascinating. Some scholars believe that the biblical writers, over time, deliberately demonized the serpent. Why? Because the serpent was closely tied to goddess worship and older, earth-based religions. You see, in many ancient cultures, serpents were symbols of feminine power and wisdom. They were connected to the earth, to fertility, and to the cycle of life and death. But as patriarchal religions started to take over, symbols of feminine power, like the serpent, were reinterpreted as dangerous or evil. The serpent in the garden may have been transformed into the villain to push this agenda, to shift the focus away from older, goddess-centered traditions and solidify the authority of a male, monotheistic god. Let's talk about someone you might not have heard much about, Lilith. If you thought the story of Adam and Eve was wild, Lilith is about to take things to a whole new level. Now, here's the thing, they didn't teach us this in Sunday school. But Lilith? She's rumored to be Adam's first wife. Yeah, before Eve ever came into the picture. So, who exactly is Lilith? Well, she doesn't show up in the traditional Bible, which is why most people have never heard of her. But in ancient Jewish folklore and mysticism, particularly in texts like the Alphabet of Ben Sira, Lilith is portrayed as this fierce, independent woman. And let me tell you, her story is far from your typical creation myth. According to legend, when God created Adam and Lilith, he made them both from the same dust, unlike Eve, who was made from Adam's rib. Now, you'd think that would mean they were equals, right? Well, Adam didn't see it that way. He expected Lilith to be subservient to him, and let's just say, Lilith wasn't having any of that. She refused to submit to Adam's authority, and things escalated pretty quickly. In one version of the story, Adam demands that Lilith obey him, but she's like, nope. Not happening. She uses a powerful, forbidden name of God, basically invoking divine power, and flies out of Eden, leaving Adam behind. Think about that for a second. Lilith was so powerful and independent that she just up and left paradise because she refused to be treated as less than equal. Talk about a boss move. After Lilith leaves, Adam's all alone and miserable. So what does God do? He creates Eve from Adam's rib, supposedly to be more submissive and to fix the situation. But here's the kicker, Lilith doesn't just disappear after she leaves Eden. She's transformed into a demon-like figure in later traditions, but not in the way you'd expect. Lilith becomes this symbol of danger, temptation, and, most importantly, female autonomy. In ancient folklore, she's often depicted as a night demon, seducing men in their sleep and stealing newborn babies. But why? Well, according to the myth, Lilith was furious that Adam was given a new wife and that the world kept going on without her. So, she was out for revenge. And this is where things get really interesting. Lilith's demonization is often seen as a reflection of ancient fears about women who didn't fit into the traditional roles of wife and mother. But here's the thing. Some scholars argue that Lilith wasn't originally a demon at all. In fact, she may have been a goddess figure, possibly linked to older Mesopotamian deities like Inanna or Ishtar, both powerful goddesses of love, war, and fertility. In these ancient cultures, Lilith, or figures like her, were revered, not feared. But as patriarchal societies grew stronger, powerful female figures like Lilith were rebranded as dangerous or evil. Sound familiar? It's kind of like what happened with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, symbols of feminine power being turned into villains. And here's another thing to think about. In some modern interpretations, Lilith has become a symbol of feminism and female empowerment. She represents the idea that women don't have to conform to societal expectations, that they can choose independence over submission. Instead of being demonized, Lilith is celebrated for her refusal to accept an unequal role in the Garden of Eden. But back to the myth. After Lilith leaves Eden, there's this cosmic tension between her and Adam's descendants. She's often portrayed as a seductress or as a mother of demons. Yet, there's something undeniably powerful about her. Lilith is not a passive character in these stories. She's active, defiant, and unapologetic about who she is. And while the ancient texts paint her in a negative light, many modern readers see her as a character who broke free from the constraints of a male-dominated world and chose her own path, even if it meant becoming an outcast. So why don't we hear more about her? Well, like I mentioned earlier, the story of Lilith didn't make it into the canonical Bible. She was kind of erased from the mainstream narrative, but she stuck around in Jewish folklore and mystical writings. And, as time went on, Lilith's legend evolved. In some versions, she's a monster to be feared, while in others, she's a misunderstood figure who was unfairly vilified. The duality of Lilith, both demon and goddess, makes her one of the most fascinating characters in all of ancient mythology. Imagine what the story of Adam and Eve would look like if Lilith hadn't been erased from it. You'd have this whole new layer of complexity, where the first woman wasn't just a passive companion, but someone who challenged the very order of creation. Instead of a straightforward fall from grace, we'd have a story of rebellion, of choosing freedom over submission, even at the cost of losing paradise. This next part takes us on a journey across the globe, connecting ancient creation myths from different cultures that you've probably never heard in the same breath as Adam and Eve. We're about to uncover stories from some of the oldest civilizations in the world, and the crazy thing is, many of them have surprising similarities to the biblical creation story. But as you'll see, they take us in completely different directions. Let's start in ancient India, with the Vedas, some of the oldest sacred texts in human history. In one of their creation myths, the universe begins with a cosmic being known as Purusha, a giant whose body is sacrificed by the gods to create the world. Yeah, you heard that right, this guy's body literally becomes the entire universe. His mouth becomes the priests, his arms become the warriors, and his feet become the common people. So, humanity is born out of this divine, sacrificial act. It's a story that's both brutal and poetic, and in many ways, it mirrors the idea of humanity being created from the body or essence of something divine, just like Adam is made from the dust of the earth in Genesis. But here's where it gets even more interesting. In some versions of the Purusha myth, there's also a female counterpart, a primordial goddess named Prakriti, who represents nature and the physical world. This cosmic duo, Purusha and Prakriti, work together to create balance in the universe. It's kind of like an ancient yin and yang. The male and female forces aren't in conflict, they're complementary, essential to the creation and maintenance of life. It's a completely different dynamic from the one we see in the Garden of Eden, where Eve is created as a helper for Adam, and things quickly spiral into conflict. Now, let's hop over to ancient Egypt, where things get even weirder. In one creation myth, the god Atum creates the first humans by, well, sneezing them out. Seriously. Atum, who represents the setting sun and is one of the original gods in Egyptian mythology, is said to have spit, sneezed, or in some versions, self-generated the first man and woman from his own body. These early humans weren't placed in a garden like Adam and Eve, they were sent out into the chaotic, untamed world, tasked with bringing order to it, which is a recurring theme in Egyptian cosmology. The Egyptian gods were constantly battling chaos, represented by the serpent god Apophis, who tried to devour the sun god Ra every night. So, in a way, the Egyptians saw humanity's role as cosmic helpers, fighting against the forces of disorder. This is a pretty different vibe from the whole don't eat the fruit story in Eden. Here, humans are warriors in a much larger, ongoing cosmic struggle, and the gods rely on them to keep the balance. But wait, we're just getting started. The Chinese have their own creation myth that's equally fascinating. In ancient Chinese cosmology, the universe began as an egg, floating in the primordial chaos. Inside this egg was the giant Pangu, who grew so large that he eventually cracked the egg open, separating heaven and earth. As Pangu grew taller, he held the sky up with his hands, creating the physical world. And when he finally died, his body transformed into mountains, rivers, and forests. Sound familiar? But here's the twist, in Chinese myth, humans were created not from Pangu's body but from the mud of the Yellow River, shaped by the goddess Nua. She crafted humans from clay, molding them by hand. And just like that, we have another myth of humans being made from the earth. But Nua wasn't creating humanity to serve the gods or clean up after them. She made humans to keep her company, to bring life and movement to the stillness of the world she'd shaped. It's a far more nurturing take on creation compared to the Sumerian idea of humans as mere servants for the gods' benefit. Now, let's go even further west, to the Inuit people of the Arctic. In their creation stories, the first humans didn't come from clay or divine blood. Instead, they emerged from the earth itself. In one myth, humans crawl out of a hole in the ground or are born from the union of animals and spirits. These first humans are deeply connected to the natural world, living in harmony with animals and the land. For the Inuit, creation wasn't about establishing dominance over nature, it was about understanding their place within it, a theme that resonates throughout many indigenous creation stories. And then we have the Native American creation myths. These stories are as diverse as the tribes that tell them, but one recurring theme is the idea of humans being born from the earth or the sky. In one Cherokee myth, humans are born when animals dig into the earth and find the first people hiding there. In another, from the Navajo tradition, the first humans emerged from different worlds, rising up from one level to the next, evolving with each new stage of creation. What's fascinating here is the idea of humanity gradually coming into existence, moving from a state of darkness or chaos into light and understanding, a journey that feels far more gradual and organic than the sudden creation of Adam and Eve in Genesis. And finally, let's circle back to the Mesoamerican cultures, particularly the Mayans. In their Popol Vuh, the creation of humanity goes through multiple failed attempts. The gods first try to create humans out of mud, but they fall apart. Then they try wood, but these beings have no souls. Finally, they succeed by crafting humans from maize, the sacred corn that was the lifeblood of the Mayan people. This version of the creation story is fascinating because it shows the gods experimenting, trying and failing before finally getting it right. It's not about perfection from the start, it's about trial and error, which gives the whole thing a much more human feel. So, across the world, from India to Egypt, China to the Americas, we see this recurring theme, humanity emerging from the earth, shaped by gods or spirits, deeply connected to the natural world. But the reasons for creation? Well, that changes depending on where you look. In some stories, we're here to serve the gods, in others, we're companions or caretakers. The common thread, though, is that these myths give us a glimpse into how different cultures have wrestled with the same question: where do we come from? Alright, this is where things really get wild. We've looked at all these ancient myths, strange parallels, and hidden stories, but what if, and stay with me here, the story of Adam and Eve wasn't just about two people at all? What if Adam and Eve were symbols of something much bigger, like an entire lost civilization? Something that predates any of the history we know? Let me take you to a theory that's been floating around in certain circles of archaeology and alternative history for a while now, the idea that the story of Adam and Eve isn't just a myth about the first humans, but a symbolic retelling of the rise and fall of an advanced, ancient civilization. Yeah, we're going there. First, think about the Garden of Eden. The Bible locates it somewhere in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, this isn't some random location. It's the cradle of civilization, where the first cities were built, and where humans developed writing, agriculture, and law. But what if Eden wasn't just a garden? What if it was a real, physical place, an advanced society, maybe even a technologically or spiritually evolved civilization, that was wiped out by some kind of catastrophe? Many scholars believe that the biblical flood story is connected to ancient Sumerian and Babylonian flood myths, as we discussed earlier. These stories all seem to point to a massive, cataclysmic event, a flood, an earthquake, or some other natural disaster that wiped out an entire civilization. Could it be that this lost civilization, this Eden, wasn't just a paradise of nature but a real city, or even a series of cities, that existed long before recorded history? And that Adam and Eve represent the last survivors of this civilization, forced to start over in a new, harsher world? This theory takes us into the realm of ancient lost cities like Atlantis, Lemuria, and the countless other forgotten civilizations that people have speculated about for centuries. Some even believe that traces of this ancient world still exist, buried beneath the sands of the Middle East, hidden in plain sight. There's evidence to suggest that around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, there was a massive global flood caused by melting glacier. Could this have been the real fall of humanity? Imagine a civilization far more advanced than we typically think of for ancient humans. Maybe they had knowledge of astronomy, engineering, or even spirituality that we've since lost. And when this civilization collapsed, whether due to natural disasters, internal strife, or some other unknown force, the survivors were left to rebuild. They passed down their knowledge through stories, oral traditions, and myths, and over time, these stories became the foundation of the myths we know today. Adam and Eve might not have been literal individuals, but representations of the human race, living in a golden age that ended in tragedy. What's really fascinating is that this isn't just some fringe idea. Archaeological discoveries at places like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, an ancient temple site that dates back over 12,000 years, are forcing historians to rethink the timeline of civilization. We're discovering that human societies were far more advanced, far earlier than we ever thought possible. It's possible that Eden was one of these early advanced cultures, and the story of Adam and Eve is a distant memory of a world long lost to time. Think about it. Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, and suddenly, they know good and evil. Could this be symbolic of a society that was destroyed by its own knowledge? Maybe they gained too much power, too much understanding, and it led to their downfall. The idea that humans, when given ultimate knowledge, will ultimately destroy themselves is a theme that repeats throughout history. So, what we're left with is a much larger, much more complex picture than just two people in a garden. Adam and Eve may be stand-ins for something far bigger, a lost age of humanity, a time when we lived in balance with the earth and with higher knowledge, until it all came crashing down. Whether it was a literal place or a symbolic one, Eden represents a paradise lost, a world we once had but can never return to. And that, my friends, is why the story of Adam and Eve still resonates so deeply today. It's not just a story about disobedience or the origin of sin, it's a story about loss, about the fragility of civilization, and about the mysteries of our past that are still waiting to be uncovered. Thanks so much for sticking around until the end of this journey. If you found this exploration of the hidden origins of Adam and Eve as mind-blowing as I did, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe. As always, thank you for watching. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.